History is filled with epic tales of empires rising and falling. But what happens when the enemy is invisible, unstoppable, and utterly terrifying? Today, we re-journeying back to the mid-14th century to uncover the story of one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, the Black Death. This wasn't just a disease. It was a cataclysm that redrew the map of the world. So, what exactly was the Black Death? Between the years 1347 and 1351, a devastating plague swept across Europe, leaving a trail of destruction that is almost impossible to comprehend today. The culprit behind this horror was a tiny bacterium called Yersinia pestis. But how did this microscopic killer manage to bring an entire continent to its knees? This bacterium had existed, living relatively harmlessly in populations of rodents like marmots. But as trade routes expanded, particularly the famous Silk Road, the world became more connected. This connectivity, which brought wealth and exotic goods, also created the perfect highway for disease. Sometime in the 1330s or 1340s, the plague began its deadly march westward. It hitchhiked on the caravans that traversed Asia, carried by its primary vectors, fleas. These tiny parasites lived on the blood of black rats, a species that thrived in the bustling, often unsanitary, conditions of human settlements and, crucially, on board merchant ships. In 1347, the plague arrived at the doorstep of Europe. Genoese trading ships, returning from the Black Sea port of Caffa, docked in Messina, Sicily. The sailors who disembarked were either already dying or dead, and the ships were infested with plague-carrying rats. The Sicilians were horrified. They quickly expelled the death ships, but it was too late. The rats had already scurried ashore, and with them, the fleas carrying their deadly cargo. From Sicily, the plague exploded across Europe with terrifying speed. It followed the trade routes, spreading from port to port, and then inland along rivers and roads. There were primarily two forms of the plague, and both were horrific. The most common was the bubonic plague. This is where the name Black Death likely gets its imagery. After being bitten by an infected flea, a person would develop a fever, chills, and painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes. These buboes, often appearing in the groin, armpits, or neck, would turn black as the tissue died. Without treatment, the bubonic plague was fatal in up to 80% of cases. But there was another, even more terrifying form, the pneumonic plague. If the infection spread to the lungs, it could be transmitted directly from person to person through airborne droplets from coughing or sneezing. This form was nearly 100% fatal and spread with incredible speed through crowded medieval cities. Imagine a disease as contagious as the common cold, but as deadly as Ebola. That was the reality of pneumonic plague. A third, rarer form, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing death within hours, often before any symptoms could even develop. The devastation was biblical in scale. It is estimated that the Black Death wiped out between 30% and 60% of Europe as population. In just 4 years, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people worldwide may have perished. Think about that for a moment. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Bustling cities were silenced. In Florence, the writer Boccaccio described how the dead were piled up in the streets, like so much garbage. There weren't enough living people to bury the dead. Mass graves were dug, and bodies were layered in pits, separated by thin layers of earth. This massive loss of life tore apart the very fabric of society. Families were shattered. Parents abandoned their sick children, and children were left orphaned. The social order collapsed. The economy ground to a halt as farmers, artisans, and merchants died. Fields went unplowed, and workshops fell silent. People lived in a state of constant terror, believing they were witnessing the end of the world. Who would be next? Your neighbor? Your spouse? Yourself? From a medieval perspective, The cause of this catastrophe was a complete mystery. The concept of germ theory was centuries away. Instead, they turned to the explanations they knew. Many believed the plague was a divine punishment from God for humanity's sins. This led to the rise of movements like the flagellants, groups of people who would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for their sins, hoping to appease God's wrath. Ironically, their travels likely helped spread the disease even further. Others blamed a miasma, or bad air. They thought that foul smells from swamps or decomposing matter could corrupt the air and cause disease. People would carry sweet-smelling flowers or burn aromatic herbs to try and purify the air around them. Physicians, relying on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, believed the plague was caused by an imbalance of these bodily fluids. Their attempts at treatment were, by modern standards, completely ineffective and often horrifying. Doctors, wearing strange beak-like masks stuffed with herbs to ward off the miasma, would perform bloodletting or lance the buboes. These procedures were not only useless, but also incredibly dangerous, often leading to secondary infections and hastening death. Desperate for a scapegoat, many communities turned on minorities, particularly Jewish people, falsely accusing them of poisoning wells and intentionally spreading the plague. This led to horrific pogroms and massacres across Europe. So what happened after the initial wave of terror subsided around 1351? Europe was a shadow of its former self. The world had been fundamentally and permanently changed. The most immediate consequence was a severe labor shortage. With so many people gone, the value of labor skyrocketed. For the first time, peasants and serfs had bargaining power. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. This shift began to erode the foundations of the feudal system, which had dominated medieval Europe for centuries. Landowners were forced to offer better terms or risk their lands falling into disuse. This massive social and economic upheaval also spurred innovation. With fewer hands to do the work, there was a greater need for labor-saving devices, which some historians argue helped pave the way for the technological advancements of the Renaissance. The authority of the Church, which had been unable to explain or stop the plague, was severely weakened in the eyes of many. People began to question long-held beliefs, fostering a new spirit of inquiry and skepticism. The Black Death was not a one-time event. While the initial pandemic was the most devastating, the plague returned in recurring outbreaks for centuries. It would flare up every generation or so, a constant, terrifying reminder of humanity's vulnerability. It took Europe about 150 years for its population to recover to pre-plague levels. The legacy of the Black Death is a sobering lesson in how a single pathogen can reshape human civilization. It reminds us of the fragility of our societies and the profound impact that disease can have on history, culture, and progress. It was a dark chapter, but one that ultimately led to the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the modern world. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this journey into history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. See you next time. Imagine a world where a mysterious illness could wipe out entire towns in a matter of weeks. A disease so swift and deadly that it reshaped the very course of human history. This isn't the plot of a disaster movie. It's the real story of the Black Death, one of the most devastating pandemics ever recorded. In the mid-14th century, from 1347 to 1351, a terrifying plague swept across Europe, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. We now know this catastrophic event was caused by a tiny yet powerful bacterium called Yersinia pestis. But for the people living at the time, it was an unstoppable, incomprehensible force that felt like the end of the world. So, how did this microscopic killer bring a continent to its knees? What was it like to live through such a terrifying time? And what were the long-lasting consequences that still echo through history today? Join us as we journey back in time to uncover the chilling story of the Black Death. Our story begins not in Europe, but in the arid plains of Central Asia. For centuries, Yersinia pestis had existed there, primarily cycling among populations of wild rodents, like marmots. For the most part, it stayed within these animal communities. But in the early 1300s, something changed. A combination of climate shifts and ecological disruptions likely pushed infected rodents closer to human settlements. This is where the story takes a fateful turn, thanks to two small creatures, the black rat and the flea. Fleas would bite an infected rodent, ingesting the plague bacteria. The bacteria would then multiply inside the flea's gut, forming a blockage. When this ravenous blocked flea then bit another host, like a black rat, it would regurgitate the bacteria into the new victim's bloodstream, passing on the infection. Black rats, also known as ship rats, were common travelers on the vast network of trade routes known as the Silk Road. As caravans moved goods like silk and spices across Asia, they unknowingly carried these infected rats and their deadly fleas with them. By the 1340s, the plague had reached the Black Sea. The city of Kaffa, a bustling trading post controlled by Genoese merchants, became a critical flashpoint. In 1346, the city was under siege by the Mongol army. As the plague began to ravage the besieging forces, their leader, Jani Beg, reportedly ordered the catapulting of infected corpses over the city walls. This is often cited as one of the earliest known instances of biological warfare. Whether this story is entirely accurate or not, the outcome was the same. The plague had breached the city. Terrified Genoese merchants fled Kaffa by sea, desperately trying to outrun the disease. But it was already on board with them, hidden away in the cargo holds among the rats and fleas. In October 1347, 12 of these death ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina. The locals were horrified by what they found. Most of the sailors aboard were either dead or gravely ill, covered in strange black boils that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities quickly ordered the ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The plague had arrived in Europe. From Sicily, the disease spread with terrifying speed. It moved along the busy maritime trade routes, hitting major port cities like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille first. From these coastal entry points, it marched inland, traveling along rivers and roads. No one was safe. It infiltrated bustling cities, quiet villages, and isolated monasteries alike. The bacteria manifested primarily in two devastating forms. The most common was the bubonic plague. After being bitten by an infected flea, a person would develop a fever, chills, and extreme weakness. Then came the telltale sign, the buboes. These were painfully swollen lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck, which would turn black as the tissue died, giving the Black Death its name. Without treatment, which didn't exist at the time, the bubonic plague was fatal in up to 80% of cases, with death usually occurring within a week. But there was an even more terrifying version, the pneumonic plague. If the bacteria reached the lungs, it could be spread directly from person to person through infected droplets in the air, just like the flu. A simple cough or sneeze could transmit the disease. The pneumonic plague was even more aggressive, with a mortality rate that was virtually 100%. People could feel fine in the morning and be dead by evening. This person-to-person transmission allowed the plague to spread even more rapidly, especially during the cold winter months when people were huddled together indoors. The sheer scale of the devastation is difficult to comprehend. Imagine waking up every day to the sound of death carts rolling down the street with criers shouting, "Bring out your dead." Life came to a standstill. Farmers died in their fields, leaving crops to rot. Priests died while giving last rites. Entire families were wiped out in a matter of days. In some areas, The death toll was so high, there was no one left to bury the dead. Mass graves were dug, and bodies were piled up like firewood. Chronicles from the time describe a world turned upside down. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, in his famous work The Decameron, wrote the social breakdown in Florence. He described how the ties of affection and kinship were torn asunder. Brother was forsaken by brother, the sister by her brother, the wife by her husband, and what is more, the father and mother refused to attend to their own children. It's estimated that the Black Death wiped out between 30% and 60% of Europe's population. That's somewhere between 75 to 200 million people in the 14th century world. Some regions were hit harder than others. Major cities like Florence and Paris may have lost over half their inhabitants. The sheer loss of life completely tore apart the social and economic fabric of medieval society. The rigid feudal system, which relied on a large peasant population to work the land for the nobility, began to crumble. With so many laborers gone, the ones who survived found themselves in a new position of power. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. Some even abandoned their feudal obligations altogether, moving to cities to seek new opportunities. This massive demographic shift would ultimately contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of a more modern, market-based economy. But in the midst of the chaos, how did medieval people make sense of it all? With no knowledge of germ theory, they were left to grasp at any explanation they could find. Many believed the plague was a divine punishment from God for the sins of humanity. Processions of flagellants roamed the countryside, publicly whipping themselves to atone for their sins, hoping to appease God's wrath. Unfortunately, their travels often helped spread the disease even further. Others looked for more earthly explanations. Medical theory at the time was dominated by the idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was believed to depend on the perfect balance of these four fluids. Sickness was the result of an imbalance. So, doctors believed the plague was caused by miasma, or bad air, a poisonous vapor corrupted by the alignment of planets, earthquakes, or decaying organic matter. Their treatments were based on these flawed theories. They tried bloodletting and boil lancing to rebalance the humors, which often just weakened the patient and spread the infection. They prescribed strange concoctions of herbs and minerals. People burned aromatic woods, like juniper and rosemary, to purify the air. Wealthy individuals carried pomanders, small balls filled with fragrant spices, holding them to their noses in an attempt to ward off the deadly miasma. Doctors wore bizarre, beak-like masks stuffed with herbs, thinking it would protect them from the poisoned air. While it looked terrifying, the mask may have offered some limited protection by creating a barrier from airborne droplets. Tragically, in their fear and confusion, people also looked for scapegoats. Jewish communities were frequently and falsely accused of causing the plague by intentionally poisoning wells. This led to horrific waves of persecution and massacres across Europe, despite the fact that Jewish people were dying from the plague at the same rate as everyone else. The initial wave of the Black Death subsided around 1351, but the world it left behind was forever changed. It took Europe about 150 years for its population to recover to pre-plague levels. The psychological scars ran deep. Art and literature from the period became obsessed with themes of death and mortality, giving rise to the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, artistic genre, which depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, from popes to peasants to their graves. It was a stark reminder that death was the great equalizer. The plague did not simply disappear after 1351. It became endemic, returning in recurring outbreaks every few decades for the next 400 years. The Great Plague of London in 1665 and the Plague of Marseille in 1720 were some of the last major epidemics in Europe. These later outbreaks, while devastating, were generally less widespread than the initial pandemic, partly because populations had built up some immunity, and people had learned through brutal experience the effectiveness of quarantine measures. The very word quarantine comes from the Venetian practice of holding ships for 40 giorni or 40 days before allowing them to dock. The Black Death was a cataclysmic event, a period of unimaginable horror and loss. But it was also a powerful catalyst for change. The immense loss of life shattered old certainties and hierarchies, paving the way for profound social, economic, and cultural shifts. It accelerated the end of the Middle Ages and arguably helped set the stage for the Renaissance. The story of the Black Death serves as a powerful and humbling reminder of the fragility of human civilization in the face of disease, and the incredible resilience of those who survive and rebuild. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into the past interesting, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments what historical event you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video.